But someone like me going to a place like Australia where they're very flippant about race, and there are just so many things I didn't understand. Like, I step out of my apartment in Melbourne and I see it's so multicultural. I see people literally from all over the world. I hear people speaking every language you could imagine. And then on TV, everyone's white. All the news anchors are white. They only talk about whiteness. They don't say anything about Aboriginal culture. I can't ask my Japanese Australian partner anything about it because he doesn't care. He didn't grow up in a place where race matters and he doesn't want to think about it.
Welcome to Flourish in the Foreign, the award-winning podcast that celebrates, elevates, and affirms the voices and stories of Black women living and thriving abroad, while exploring living abroad as a pathway to wellness. I'm your host, Christine Job, a Black American with Trinidadian roots, business strategist and writer from Atlanta, based in Valencia, Spain. Hey everyone, welcome back to Flourish in the Foreign. I am Christine, the host and creator of this here podcast. If you are new, hi, welcome to the show. So happy to have you here. Before we get into today's episode, don't forget to check out my Substack, Flourish in the Foreign, Truths and Musings. It's where I share my personal thoughts on life abroad. I share with you all this author journey that I have been on. It feels like it's been 40,000 days and nights. And of course, the full conversations with my season 6 guests. So if you've ever wondered what gets left on the cutting room floor, or if you're like, do they really just cut up in these interviews? We do. I know you probably don't think that. You probably think it's all serious business. We be having a key. So I don't know about y'all. We be having a great time. Yeah, we've been having a great time. This is your chance to dive deeper. So check out the Substack today. Finally, I am collecting questions for the Ask Me Anything episode. So, whether it's for me, a guest, or an expert, submit your questions by the end of March 2025 so that I can answer these questions or get them answered by experts or guests. You can email me these questions at hello@flourishintheforeign.com or leave a voice note via the link in the description. All right, let's get into today's episode. Season 6, Episode 12. Today's guest is Heather Thomas. Heather is a coach and instructional designer earning a master's in applied psychology in Cork, Ireland. She likes island life in the unconventional sense, having lived in Japan, Australia, and now Ireland. She is studying positive psychology and coaching psychology, examining the ways that both of these fields can better serve underrepresented populations, particularly women of color. I really enjoyed my conversation with Heather, and I know you all will as well. So, without further ado, I'll let Heather tell y'all all about it.
I'm Heather. I'm 40 and I'm in Cork, Ireland. I've lived in Japan 3 times. I think that's a total of 3 years. I've lived in Australia for 2.5. And then I've been in Ireland for the past 5 months. So that's about 6 years abroad. I grew up in a small town in Northeast Ohio. Growing up, I wasn't exposed to a lot of diversity. And actually, the school I went to was majority white. So that really shaped how, my behavior in the world. And I was really conscious of how people view you and how they would interpret everything about your race based on how you as an individual act. So that was some pressure as a little brown kid growing up. I went to a small university small college in the town near where I grew up, in the town I was born. And my mom had been working at that college. So she was really adamant that I went there. And there are a lot of arguments about it because I just knew it was going to be more of the same of what I was experiencing in high school in terms of the social dynamics. I really fought her on that, but money does matter when it comes to choosing university. And I did get a tuition discount because I was a relative of someone working at the universities. I had wanted to study fashion design, so that would have been at a different school and that would have been not funded by anything other than loans. So it just wasn't an option at the time. And then in terms of why I chose Japan or why I chose Japanese, it was just so different from what I had been exposed to in my very small town. How do I say this in a way that doesn't sound offensive? For most Americans, they feel like, at least at that time, European culture was what you would want to try to emulate. That's the most sophisticated to a lot of people. And for some reason, I just didn't agree. It's not like I didn't have any interest in Europe at all. I just had different ideas about what was interesting or compelling. And I guess like a country full of more white people, to my understanding at that age, just wasn't as compelling as a country in Asia where, I mean, I had never even met an Asian person until high school. So there were just a lot of reasons why it was appealing to me to seek out diversity because I hadn't been exposed to it for most of my life. Because I couldn't go to fashion school, my mom suggested that I study abroad. Slowly, I started to realize that studying abroad meant that I got to leave the city that I was living in. I don't know why I didn't connect with that part at first, but my first thing was like, oh, you just don't want me to go to fashion school. But once I got it in my head, no, Heather, this means that you can leave Ohio. Don't you want to leave Ohio? Once I started to see it that way, I was saving up tons of money in a shoebox. Yes, cash in a shoebox in rural Ohio in 2004. That's what I was doing. And so it was in Osaka, Japan, that I was studying abroad. It was an exchange program for Kansai Gaidai University. Most people who have studied abroad there have such like deeply nostalgic and fond feelings and memories about going there. The first night I got there, it was a little bit earlier than some of the other students. So it was at night. They took you to the dorm. They showed you where to go to sleep. My roommate wasn't there yet. She hadn't arrived to the country yet. So it was just me. So the first night, laying in a futon in Japan by myself in this dark dorm room, I'm thinking, what have I done? I'm all alone in this new country. But by the next day, I was completely over that and just like curious to meet the people in the dorms. I will say that having the experience of being visibly Black in another space or visibly brown or visibly other outside of the US is just so different than inside the US. So my experience in high school and college as the person that I don't know, like how I appear in the world, how I present in the world. Even with the Black people in the community, people just thought that I was a freak. Like they would call me like Wednesday Adams. I got a fro before it was cool to have a fro. So like at the end of high school, I was walking around malls and wherever else there is to go in rural Ohio with a fro, and there are adult people pointing and laughing at me. So that was my experience living in the US. I didn't even know what to expect when I got to Japan, but nobody was pointing and laughing at me. Nobody was telling me that I was presenting as Black wrong. People would ask me where I was from, and American is the identity that I had, not like weird Black girl or weird racially ambiguous freak. I just found it comfortable. And I don't really have a problem with people staring at me out of curiosity. It's a completely different feeling than people staring at me because they hate the way I exist. So that part was easy, honestly. And there are just so many different cultures being represented at the university that you're not always thinking like, oh, well, I'm this person of color, especially in the context of being in an Asian country. It's just not the first thing on your mind. So you get to present as yourself, and then people have to decide whether you as a person is someone they vibe with rather than you as like a black weirdo freak that they don't want to be next to. So it was really easy, and Japanese people know that foreigners are a little bit different and they accept that, and it's totally fine, and they're attracted to and interested in foreigners, especially at that university, because gaidai, like part of it is studying other cultures. So everyone was really cool and nobody was weird about it. And any personality clashes or whatever were just not racially related. It wasn't part of the experience, really.
So, Heather has been studying abroad in Japan, and now the program has come to an end. I asked her what that transition period was like for her as she went back to the US.
Preparing to go back to the States was devastating. I just didn't know what the heck I was going to do. Going back to just more of the same of what I had experienced in Ohio, I was just like really unhappy with needing to go back and knowing that I still had 2 more years of university before I could graduate. So I applied to a few art schools when I got back. I just wanted to find a way to take some control of my environment to make the most of the last 2 years of university. And I ended up getting into an art school in Chicago. So I went to Chicago for a year after Japan. When I was in art school, it was very intense. You have one class for 8 hours a day. But of course, my first thought is, how can I go abroad again? How can I study abroad twice in university? So I had applied to study at Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Australia and actually did get accepted there. But before I could finalize those plans in the last year of school, I needed to actually move back to Ohio because my mom was diagnosed with cancer. So the idea of going abroad again was put on hold until I went back to Ohio. And then I did apply to go abroad again when I transferred back to my school in Ohio, and I was rejected by the chair of the art department. I actually ended up using my first credit card to go to Australia anyway and use pictures from that in my final art show because that's the kind of person that I am. I was in a long distance relationship with an Australian guy at the time, like while I was finishing up college. So I could go visit him and do whatever art I wanted to do in terms of the photography while I was in Australia and at least have a place to stay while I was going. So it was borderline affordable. That's how I got around it. It wasn't a perfect substitute for studying abroad again. And I feel like I really missed out on a really cool opportunity to have that double study abroad experience. But I graduated at the end of May of 2007. I really wanted to go to graduate school abroad, but the window to do that was pretty limited. And I do not recommend this, but I applied to the university. I got in. I had to be there for orientation in July of 2007. I was calling immigration all the time to check and triple check. And they would say, it's not recommended, but you can go on a tourist visa and then apply for a student visa. And then I had a partner in Australia at that time. So I had him calling on his end, immigration in country and checking, can you do this? And they're like, yeah, no worries. It's fine. So the whole time flying the ridiculous number of hours, 24 hours or something to actually get to Australia from Ohio. I'm just basically shitting my pants like, will I get turned away at the border? I don't know. Spoiler alert, I did not. And I was able to apply for my student visa in country, but I don't recommend that because that was really stressful and a little bit too brazen for someone like me who likes things to be planned out ahead of time. The program that I applied to initially was called Graduate Diploma of LOTE, LOTE, which stands for Language Other Than English Teaching. Because I have the Japanese major, I could study to teach Japanese. And then you have to choose, are you going to teach Japanese in elementary, which they call primary school, or secondary school, high school? So I chose primary school. A graduate diploma is a 1 year degree. It is very similar to any other graduate level classes and is fully recognized in Australia and Europe. But in America, they don't know what the hell you're talking about. So this graduate diploma of LOTE also included a teaching practice. So I did a teaching practice at a place called Ivanhoe Grammar School, which is a private school in Melbourne. And I worked with a Japanese teacher there, getting some experience on how to teach Japanese in an English speaking school. La Trobe University itself was very chill. I didn't feel very stressed by the course load. I didn't feel very stressed by anything really than just the fact that it is so self-directed. They give you so much reading and you just do it on your own. They expect you to do it on your own. But having never been in any academic program in Australia before, I didn't really know what to do at first. So it's just a challenge to figure out how to make it work for me. I lived with my partner, so I wasn't living on campus or living in student housing, and that was definitely a privilege. I was able to work while I was studying. I worked at a Mexican restaurant called Taco Bill that was owned by a Chinese family. So that was an interesting experience. And in terms of the overall culture of Australia and how it felt compared to Japan or the US, or just what was the vibe like, how did I feel there? This was caveat. This was between 2007 and 2010, and things could have changed since then. And also, I understand that I am an American who grew up in America, and we are obsessed with race and identified by race, and that's both by choice and because that's how we're conditioned, and that's because how our country was founded, and all kinds of reasons why. But someone like me going to a place like Australia where they're very flippant about race, and there are just so many things I didn't understand. Like, I step out of my apartment in Melbourne and I see it's so multicultural. I see people literally from all over the world. I hear people speaking every language you could imagine. And then on TV, everyone's white. All the news anchors are white. They only talk about whiteness. They don't say anything about Aboriginal culture. I can't ask my Japanese Australian partner anything about it because he doesn't care. He didn't grow up in a place where race matters and he doesn't want to think about it. And then most white Australians use pretty derogatory language to joke about other races. So I found that really upsetting. And I was surrounded by a lot of white Australians because my Australian partner went to private school. A lot of the Australians there were white. So I heard some pretty fucked up things from them, even though some of them had studied abroad in the US. So they knew that I would be sensitive to certain things and they just didn't care. And I would try to tell them and they just didn't care how it affected me. I'll never forget one of his friends. She was a journalist and she covered some story about people of color in Australia that I found really interesting. But then she was asking me about Native culture in America. and whether indigenous people like to be called redskins. And I was like, what the hell are you saying to me? Like, what? I said, no, it's really offensive and people don't want to be called redskins. And she was like, I reckon they should just get over it. And I'm like, I don't know how to reason with something like this mindset. And that's where they were at that time between 2007 and 2010. It's weird. We went through this whole cultural reckoning in 2020, and white people in the US could ask their questions to people of color, especially Black people. And that was interesting. But I just don't ever imagine that happening in Australia. It's not exactly hostile, but they don't fucking care that you don't want to be called a Negro.
Heather has shared a lot about her experience in Australia, and I have to say, her relationship with her then boyfriend definitely sparked my interest, I would say. So I asked her if there was any intercultural tension between her and her then boyfriend, and how did she navigate it?
So, studying abroad is the perfect opportunity to meet someone who might not be right for you that you'll never realize until 5 years down the line because you've done all these things to make it work. And the setting in which you meet someone when you're having an amazing time and you're meeting all these different people from different cultures, the reality is so delayed because of the romantic and romanticized atmosphere of meeting someone while studying abroad. It's just like the perfect setup for a young person to have an amazing time and to meet someone and see like the best in them and to just be so fascinated and captivated by their cultural background and be curious about it. But what happens when you're 20 is so different to what happens when you graduate from college and then start to move into adulthood. It was just like the perfect time to meet and really hit it off. And then as we started to mature and move into adulthood, things became pretty complex. So we met in Japan, and then I was in Chicago, and we would sit on the phone and cry and try to figure out, like, should we open our relationship while we're in these two different places or not? And then just like never really come to a satisfactory conclusion. And just like there's nobody else in our lives who are trying to figure out how to do a relationship on Skype. And back when you still use calling cards, like those international calling cards to call each other. So somehow we just like managed to figure it out. And then he was in the position where he was going to move on and definitely establish at least his first real full job in the field of finance, which is what he studied. He wanted to do that in Australia. So my role was to figure out a way to do grad school in Australia if we wanted to stay together. That was what I wanted to do anyway. I wanted to study abroad for grad school. So that was totally fine. So that's how we ended up staying together for 5 years. But really, I think because of like where we were at developmentally and all of the things that happen in adulthood and as you move into full independence and all of the different things in life catch up with you, that's like such a different experience from the age of 20 to the age of 26 when we broke up. So when I moved to Australia, when we moved in together, it's pretty much when the relationship ended and just neither of us knew it yet. But he just wasn't really ready for, first of all, to be in such a intimate situation. I don't know. He really just fell apart and wasn't able to be a good partner once I moved in. He had a drinking problem, which I mean, he's Australian, so does that come with a passport, maybe? And that I think it was exacerbated by the fact that we were living together. I think he found it stressful that I would ask him questions and try to get help about like how to navigate transportation. I think he just felt like a lot of responsibility. And he was the one working full time, and I was a student, and I also worked. But I think like his financial part of the relationship, I think he felt a little bit of stress about that. Even though these are all things that we agreed to and we talked about, it's just the reality of it is way different. So he went from admiring me from afar for most of our relationship to being up close and personal and just actually realizing that maybe he didn't want to be in a serious relationship, but that the romanticization of meeting the way we did, he just had a really hard time coping with the fact that it wasn't really working. And then I was just believing him when he said that it was okay when clearly it was not okay. So when I graduated from grad school, I actually did another program after the LOTE teaching degree, and that was called a Graduate Diploma of Education, which gives you the ability to apply for a teaching license in Australia. So I applied for the teaching license in Australia and I was looking for work there, but I couldn't really find any. So he and I had made this agreement that I would go ahead to Japan and he would come eventually to Japan as well after he finished up his work and got everything settled with moving out of the apartment that we had rented and stuff like that. But while I was in Japan by myself is when I realized that things really weren't working out between us. So I broke up with him then. But he did, bless him, he did come to Japan anyway and try to win me back. But it just wasn't, I knew, and I think he knew deep down that it just couldn't work.
So now Heather is returning to Japan. I was really curious to know what her experience was in this return to Japan, especially after living in Australia.
So I ended up teaching at a school in Nara, Japan, and it was not the most rural place because I could take a train to get there, but it was fairly rural. And I was the only teacher. And there was another school that they owned. So the wife would teach at that school in Osaka that they owned. And then I was teaching at the school in Nara that they owned. And the husband, he had fluent Japanese. So he was working as the manager of both of the schools. So most of the time he would be there at my school because I wasn't an owner operator. So he would be there. And so I didn't meet any other teachers because there are no other teachers to meet. So it was a pretty isolated time. And I ended up renting this really big house a few train stops away from the school. That experience of teaching was really awesome. Working in a conversation school is so fun and I really loved it. And it was like a lot of conversation schools, it was teaching kids of a bunch of different ages and then teaching adults as well. And it's really cool to teach adults because they use English sometimes as a way to break out of the expectations that Japanese and Japanese culture confines them to. So I would hear all kinds of really interesting stories and people would open up to me in really surprising ways. And I just thought it was really cool and kind of magical, the things that people have chosen to share with me. And they ended up selling the school. They wanted to sell it to me, but I was only 26 and I didn't know what I was doing. So I didn't buy the school from them. If you just try to think back to 2010, there's just not a lot of information available anywhere to give you guidance on what to do when your school is being sold. This was my first job in Japan. And even though my experience in the school was really awesome, there were some questionable things about the owners. So that made it hard for me to feel like I could confidently find the next job and feel like it would be the right decision for me. So I had a moment where I just really didn't know what to do next. And I thought I could reset by going back to the US.
Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying this episode of Flourish in the Foreign. And if you are, please consider supporting this labor of love, but labor nonetheless, by buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/flourishforeign. Make sure that you are subscribed to the podcast and please review the podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to the show. Fun fact, if you listen on Spotify, you can leave me comments that I can actually respond to. Yeah. Make sure you follow the podcast on Threads, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and all the other social media platforms that the podcast has. If you want to read more of my personal truths and musings as I explore and navigate the intersection of migration, Blackness, womanhood, and wellness, be sure to subscribe to my Substack, Flourish in the Foreign, Truths and Musings by Christine Job. And for all other Flourish in the Foreign resources about moving, living, and thriving abroad, including guides, courses, and more, be sure to go to flourishintheforeign.com. All right. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Flourish in the Foreign. Now, back to the episode. Heather decides to return to the United States. I asked her to describe what re-entry was like and how she was able to manage that transition.
I don't think anything could have possibly prepared me for going back to the States and going back in a way where I was going into an environment where I was going to be at a slight disadvantage because I was going back without a job and without a car. Because so many people have not lived abroad, they just see you as having some kind of deficit because you're not at the same stage as them. So, like, even though I had just graduated from grad school and I had just been working as a teacher and I could speak Japanese, nobody sees that. They see you as being broke and not having a car. They couldn't give a fuck about anything else. So they can sit there and listen to your travel stories for like one night while they're getting stoned, and then they just don't care and they don't want to hear it again. And they don't care about the fact that you are trying to figure things out as an adult in a way that looks different for them. They just think that there's something wrong with you, that you're not immediately doing all the things that they're able to do. So it took a while for me to find my footing. And it was so weird to be carrying all these experiences and these like ways of showing your value in the world that nobody gives a fuck about. So that was really challenging for me and really disorienting. At some point in my disorientation, I had applied for an ESL instructor position at a community college in Raleigh, and I forgot all about it. And then 2 years into being back in the States, I finally got an interview when I was working at a cafe. And not to toot my own horn, but of course I did well in that job. I'm a passionate person who had an education background. Like, I was going to be able to teach in a community college. It was possible for someone like me to do that, even if I hadn't been able to prove that for a few years. So I did really well in that job, and I ended up teaching at another community college. And in 2014, I decided to go back to Japan. And I had a partner at the time who was also a teacher. So it was easy for both of us to find teaching jobs in Japan. And I used a website called Ohio Sensei. It is a privately owned conversation school that has been in Numazu since 1964, maybe. I really enjoyed working there. I was riding my bike everywhere. Like, the apartments that we stayed in were like a 5-minute walk from the beach. You can see Mount Fuji from the beach. I could see Mount Fuji when I would open my door to go outside. It's amazing. It's huge. It's mesmerizing. You get hypnotized by it. You feel compelled to look at it all the time. It's really interesting. And it's a medium-sized town. So it's not super packed with tons of things to do like Tokyo, but there are still plenty of things to do. I really enjoyed working with the kids, but especially the adults, because again, those conversation classes, especially the one-on-one classes, people just treat it like a sacred place where they can say whatever they want. So you just have the most interesting conversations when you're not using a textbook and you can just go with whatever the student wants to talk about. Like some old men are talking about weird stuff about China or Korea, like weird, vaguely racist stuff. But like a lot of the times, people are talking about just really interesting human experience type things. Like this woman who was in her 80s who was saying that she had very melancholy times that week because she and her husband were fighting. And it's like, lady, you're 80. What are you fighting about? I'm so interested. But she said, I don't want to tell you. So remains a mystery to this day, but it's just, I love teaching English. I love Japanese people and the variety of personalities. A lot of people have the impression that Japanese people are all just like polite and only one way and very rigid and structured. And sure, the culture kind of requires that in certain situations. But Japanese people are as diverse in personality and interest as any other human on the planet. And as homogenous as the culture is, there's still a lot of diversity of thought. And in 2016, I moved on to an international school. So I was working in the early years in an international school classroom. It's a bilingual school. So I was working with a Japanese teacher as well. And we were working a full curriculum. We use the Scottish curriculum for excellence, and it's super open to what the students are interested in, which means it's a lot of work for the teacher. But if you get a good one, which I won't say too many bad things about my school, but I had some issues with the principals and the administrator, which is no surprise. Plenty of teachers can say the same thing. I had some kids with special needs that just weren't being addressed in my class, so I couldn't stay at that school. And so in the end of 2016, I did end up going back to North Carolina again. And again, I will say that like things have advanced. Even now, I still have to remind myself that there are so many other visa options because even back in the end of 2016, it was still, you just have to go back to the States unless you're going to get another teaching job. Like, what other options do you have? But at that time, I just felt like there wasn't another good direction for me to go in.
Heather decides to return to the United States. I asked her to describe what reentry was like and that transition.
So I went back and I had learned some things from the first time going back. So I had money set aside to have a down payment for a car. So I bought a car within a few days of arriving back in the States. And I was staying with a friend. And again, she was under the impression that like I was getting back on my feet, which like, what? I have savings. I just bought a car and I'm employable. So I'll have a job within like a month. So I'm not really sure what you think I'm getting back on my feet from. But anyway, I was able to find a job in this company that does after school care programming. I ended up getting full-time work there as an instructional designer. And so I had been doing that until last year. So I will say that if you go from abroad back to the States, in this year of 2025, I'm going to give myself a little bit of grace because in 2016, things were just not the way that they are now in terms of the visas and also just the access to information. But if you leave from wherever you are abroad and go back to the States without some kind of plan of how you can work it to get back abroad if you want to, or just like have some kind of mindset that like this is temporary, you're probably going to get stuck because you have skills and people care about those a little bit more now than they used to, your skills from other places. But if you don't have a plan for how you're going to go abroad again, you'll probably get stuck for a while. I think it was for my best interest that I went back to the States because I wouldn't have this whole other career in instructional design if I hadn't gone back. But that wasn't a plan, that was pure luck and good fortune.
I wanted to know what was going on in Heather's life when she decided to go abroad again.
I had actually started working at a pretty well-known fintech company. I won't name drop, but it was a really good opportunity. So I had to put the idea of going abroad on hold, and at least until I could figure out whether or not I could have longevity at that company because it's a multinational company. There are options depending on how the economy is doing that you can get transferred somewhere. I was working as a contractor waiting to be hired on full time. And I was eventually hired on full time, but I was so disappointed with the compensation being offered and honestly offended. So I started to look for another job. So I was able to get quite a pay increase in the last job that I had. And to really prove some of my skill set, I was working in a finance company and I really saw firsthand that like the kind of lifestyle that a lot of my coworkers had just wasn't gonna work for me and it started to make me feel claustrophobic. So I definitely had this attitude about what I was gonna do next. So I got it in my head, okay, these people are paying me an amount that like is almost unbelievable. And what am I gonna do with that? I've been able to save money. What have I always wanted to do, or what have I not been able to do that I have the financial means to do suddenly out of nowhere now? And I had been trying to go back to school for years. Like I've been accepted into like 5 different grad schools and that I just couldn't afford over the years. So I said, okay, well, I have enough to actually afford it somewhere. So I started looking at programs. And of course, the first place you go is an MBA. So I was looking at MBA programs. But every time I would look at the course description, I would just want to scream. Okay, so MBA is definitely out. So what then? I stumbled upon this program for positive psychology and coaching. And I was looking in places like Canada and Ireland simply because they're close enough to my siblings that I might see them again if I stay abroad. So that was where my head was at when I made all these decisions. And so I applied to 3 programs in Ireland, not just this positive psychology and coaching one. By some miracle, I was accepted to all of them. I was rejected by the one I applied to in Canada. And so I had to choose between the 3 in Ireland, and I had the means and time to visit Ireland and do a mini scouting trip to see which city I could vibe with the best. And I always had it in the back of my head that Cork would probably be the one, especially with the positive psychology and coaching program. So that's how I ended up here in August of 2024 in Cork, Ireland. I was under the impression because after you graduate from a degree program in Ireland, you can stay up to 2 years beyond that and look for a job and then get sponsored by a job. I thought that might be my path, but I wasn't sure. And it was only by coming here and living here that I could know. And it turns out that this isn't the right place for me. After the program is done, I will not be staying and nobody did anything to me, so don't worry about it. I'm just not vibing with it here. It's just not a good fit for a lot of reasons that don't make any sense to anyone but the individual, right? So it's not, I personally wouldn't say like something bad happened to me, just like nothing bad happened to me in Australia. I could have stayed there too, but it just wasn't my place. I didn't feel like it was my forever home. The only place I've really felt like that is Japan, but I have to be very strategic about the visa process because it's not like in some places in Europe where you have like a digital nomad visa that can be extended and things like that. You have to be really strategic. So that's like the long-term goal is to go back to Japan. But in this short term, in the few months that I have left in this program before classes are finished and I can go fuck off to wherever to finish my dissertation, I have to decide where I'm going next. And of course, it's tempting to just like think that if I go back to the US for a few months, I can find my footing and then go to the next place. But I know what happens when I do that. So I don't think that's the answer. So I've been looking into other places and there's nothing for certain yet because I am so easily captivated by all the different places in the world. Although it does sound nice to go to Spain for a few months and finish writing my dissertation.
I asked Heather to describe her experience studying in Ireland and how it compared to her experiences studying in Japan and Australia.
I guess I could say it's like an accelerated master's program because it's a 1 year program. And a lot of master's programs are 2 year programs. And even some of the master's programs here are 2 year programs. So everybody acts as if everything that's happening is normal. And then you're just like struggling with your whole body and full self to keep up. Like, didn't have any warning. Yeah, of course, you expect a 1 year program to be intense, but we just did not know what we were getting into until we were in the middle of it and we were seeing how many assignments we're going to be due. There are people who are crying every weekend, like just thinking that they were never going to be able to meet these expectations. They also want you to start writing the proposal for ethics for the dissertation. So you have to know what your dissertation is starting like 6 weeks into the program. I don't have a psychology background. Some of the people in my program do. For this particular degree, it is not a requirement to have a psychology background, but for writing an ethics proposal and deciding what a dissertation even entails, a psychology background certainly helps you because you've written similar things before. You know what qualitative means, for example. So, yeah, there's a positive psychology class that we took that really gets you deep into the PERMA model, which is positive emotions. It is engagement, relationships, motivation, and meaning. And achievement. That's like the base for the PERMA model, which is like the foundation of the model of positive psychology. And then there's an add on, which is health or vitality. So all of those components we really study and look into the research on. And it's really interesting. It's very, well being forward. But then on top of that, you're taking classes with other psychology students on how to do quantitative and qualitative research. And you're just struggling through every class, trying to make sense of everything. And then at the very end of everything, usually when all the classes are finished, is when all of the assignments are due. And for some of the classes, there's one assignment and it's your whole grade. And so I took one elective last semester, and then with all of the required classes, the core classes, we wrote 25,000 words in 6 weeks. In terms of like comparison to Australia, the graduate programs that I did in Australia, it's very different. Obviously, because I'm studying something different, but also just the pace of everything is different. For the way the semester is set up, we just started the second semester this week. We're going to be finished by the end of March. So not only is it a lot of information in a short amount of time, it's also just like a short semester. One thing I will say, and this was missing in my Australian master's too, which is more surprising here, is that there's no diversity, equity, inclusion component baked into the classes so far that I have seen. And part of that may be because the field of positive psychology is new. It's only been around since 2000. And part of that could be because coaching literature is still pretty limited. The research on coaching, there are just so many gaps in the research. But I think also because Ireland didn't even really have any diversity to speak of until over the past 25 years, they're still trying to figure out what it means. And it's different than a place like Australia because in Australia, they want to just make fun of difference all the time or dismiss it. And it's different than in the US because your difference either brings you closer together with people or makes you a target for violence and aggression. But in Ireland, difference is not really thought about by the majority population. They're not thinking about us. They're not curious about us. We don't cross their mind. And it's not really a hostile thing. It's not a racism thing, so to speak, in the way that Americans understand it anyway, the way that we can like define it and notice it covertly or overtly. It's just absent from the minds of many people in the majority population. So it's not really in my coursework. I'm not seeing it. And that's distressing to me because that's part of what I think could be the most beneficial thing about positive psychology and the part that a lot of people just miss out on coaching. If you think about who is being coached in like a corporate space or like an executive level, you're probably thinking of like a white man. So there's a lot of people who could benefit from coaching, in my opinion, who are just not being reached by coaching. And I think that needs to change, and it could have already changed, but we really need to catch up with that. Coaching is not some kind of elite thing that only the most wealthy people can access. It's a very human process that is very transformative, and anybody can have access to it and should have access to it. We need to find more ways to incorporate it. It's different than the therapy that people can access. It's a different relationship. A therapeutic relationship is a very specific type of relationship. A coaching relationship is more of a co-creation. And the coachee is really the one leading everything. And the change comes from the person having these conversations out loud. So all of that is to say there are gaps in the program in terms of what else could be included. And maybe it's just because it just can't fit into a 1-year master's. I don't know. But in my dissertation, I'm addressing that. So I'm going to be focusing on women of color who work in Ireland and how they access or don't access workplace well-being. Is it a thing for them? Do they even know what those words are? How are they feeling? What's it like for them? I'm trying to tap into that and see if there's anything that I can do in the research to improve that situation in terms of positive psychology.
I asked Heather whether or not she has thought about aging abroad. And if so, what does aging well abroad look like to her?
I think aging well abroad as a woman starts with understanding how perimenopause and menopause are going to slap you in the face and deciding what your care can look like. And so part of the research for me in terms of looking at the long term for my life abroad is trying to figure out where I could access care, because there are a lot of things that are coming out in terms of what perimenopause and menopause looks like, but some very specific things that in some cultures would be really shameful to talk about and would make it difficult to access care for menopause and perimenopause. So part of my process isn't necessarily choosing the country that seems to have the best medical care, but just thinking about what alternatives I could have if I'm not getting the care that I'm hoping for in my permanent place that I'm living. So that's really important to me. And I'm still trying to figure that out. And it might be something that nobody really knows yet because they aren't doing enough research on menopause. And it looks like different countries only look for different things, and no one's on the same page and looking at all the same things that they should be looking at. Other types of wellness for aging abroad certainly involve community, but then also how does that country treat their elders? What options are there for you as someone who is aging? What's the medical care like? What's the wait time at an emergency room? It's really long in Canada and the US. Here in Ireland, my friend just recently had a seizure and she had to wait 9 hours in the emergency room. So there are a lot of things that still aren't perfect in a lot of places, and you have to be realistic about that. Another thing that's very important in terms of aging is housing and housing options. So, in a place like Ireland, the housing crisis doesn't really even define the level of scarcity that is happening with housing. So, I'm not going to be, I don't know, 65 and living in someone's spare room. That's just not going to be the life for me. So I can't stay in Ireland long term because that's how difficult it is in terms of finding housing. So housing is important. And then access to healthy food, the price of food, those things are important. And in terms of finance, I think we do have this advantage as Americans of being able to make something work online. So that part I'm not as worried about. I've worked online for the past 7 years. I'm pretty sure I can keep doing that to some capacity. So that part, even though I was a very underpaid teacher for half of my career, so I don't have a lot of retirement savings right now, I think I'll be okay. I think I can catch up. But that is something to keep in mind. Just what are things that you can do? What are skills that you can have that will contribute to the ease as you age? I think in terms of like a partner, I don't know if I would be a very good caregiver because I've had to do so much care earlier in my life. So if I do have a partner, we would have to live somewhere where I can pay for the care if either of us would need it. I've just seen what my sister had to do with death care for our parents and like the craziness of applying for Medicare and like having to liquidate assets to even get access to Medicare and then like taking care of someone's estate when they didn't have it properly sorted. So you have to get a lawyer and all of that. Like, don't do that. Don't live in the US and die unexpectedly.
Wellness. I asked Heather what is her personal definition of wellness and how has that definition and her practice of wellness been influenced by all of her time abroad.
You're asking a positive psychology student what their definition of wellness is. I've picked this apart now. Whatever it was before, I'm confused about what it is now. It's different to me in this iteration of life, especially because I feel like I can't access it in the way that I could before because of the rigorousness of my program. So in a way, it's like a tragic question to be asked because I think wellness is something that you should be able to access at any moment. And I feel like I can't right now. However, I do think that once the craziness of this program has finished, my definition of wellness is a pace of life and of outside expectations of me that don't always feel so urgent and rushed and don't bring out the codependency tendencies that I have, which are to serve others before really even noticing how I'm feeling. So having a pace of life and a pace of the expectations of what I need to do to sustain myself that are slow enough that I can do them in a way that feels good to me, that feels healthy, and I'm not rushing everywhere. I still have to remind myself over and over being here that I don't have to walk so fast because I'm constantly just like rushing everywhere. It's like the city life just really like feeds into my feeling of needing to move fast. So being able to slow down is very important in terms of wellness. And then I really like the concept in like nutrition and which is adding things. You like different foods that might not necessarily be healthy on their own, but you can add something using that practice in your life. What are things that you can add to your life that make things better? What are things that you can swap out, like of your routine that you already do that can improve your life? So, a long time ago, I happened to enjoy powerlifting and lifting in general. And I've continued that because it felt good for me. And in this program, we had to do a self case study. I chose to take some of the podcast listening that I was doing and swap it out for lo-fi music, and I actually had to scientifically study it over a period of a month and see whether or not it improved my well-being to listen to instrumental music with no lyrics for 1 month. And it did seem to have some significance. So things like that, having the flexibility and the curiosity about yourself to experiment with what works for you is part of wellness. And I think in different parts of your life, you're going to have different ways of accessing wellness, and you do have to adjust. I think the basic things like getting enough sunlight, getting exercise, getting the right foods for your body are important, but so is pleasure, so is doing things that you like to do that you don't have to explain to anyone about. So I don't know. I'm very introverted, so I don't know if I'm just like very precious about my free time and my time that's just for myself. But not having to explain yourself and not having to explain why you like things and surrounding yourself with people who just are okay with who you are is also part of the wellness.
Thank you so much, Heather, for sharing your incredible story and insights with all of us. If you're interested in keeping up with Heather, you can online.
I don't have social media. I have LinkedIn. You can access me on LinkedIn or nowhere in terms of social media.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Flourish in the Foreign. To learn more information about this guest, be sure to check out their show notes page on the website flourishintheforeign.com. If you'd like me to come speak to your group, your organization, your sorority, your company, or any other type of entity, I can. Yes, did you know that? I can. I am available for paid speaking engagements, which includes in-person talks as well as remote talks. Yes, I do travel. I really do. If you're interested in booking me for an in-person or remote paid speaking engagement, you can find my media kit, my speaker page, and all booking information on the website flourishintheforeign.com, also on my personal website, christinejob.com, and in the description of this here episode. If you'd like to delve deep into my personal thoughts about life abroad, be sure to subscribe to my Substack, Flourish in the Foreign, Truths and Musings. If you enjoy this solo indie Black woman podcast, be sure to support this podcast by buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/flourishforeign. You can also support the podcast by subscribing to the podcast, leaving a review of the podcast, and of course, sharing the podcast. For resources like the Move Abroad with Intention guide and course, be sure to check the links in the description of this episode and the website flourishintheforeign.com. To learn more about me, Christine Job, my work as a business strategist, and all my resources about business strategy, building a business, and more, check out the links in the description of this episode and go to christinejob.com. Big thanks to all of you, my lovely listeners who have kept this podcast going strong for 6 seasons. Thank you all so much. I love you and I appreciate you. And thanks to Zachary Higgs for producing the music for this here podcast. Remember, it is not about moving abroad. It's not about being abroad. It's about thriving abroad. It's about flourishing abroad. So go abroad and cultivate a life well lived. See you next time. Bye. In the next episode of Flourish in the Foreign.
I contemplated having my son in the United States, right? In fact, I have another dear American friend, a little white girl from like Minnesota or somewhere in the middle America. But I remember she came to me and we ended up being pregnant very close to each other. So she was like, gave birth like 2 months before me. And she was like, Thea, don't give birth in the United States. They kill Black women there. My little blonde, blue-eyed friend from Middle America was like, don't have babies in the States because they kill Black women there. Just the fact that she even knew that is complimentary to her. But I think she was part of the reason I was like, nah, I'm not going to do this.